Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session, Putting Ethics Bowl to Work. My name is Alex Richardson. I'm the director of the National High School Ethics Bowl, which is based at the Parr Center for Ethics at UNC Chapel Hill.
My name is Michael Vazquez. I teach in the philosophy department at UNC, and I direct the outreach program in philosophy and at the Parr Center for Ethics. So today we're excited to talk to you about a really exciting application of Ethics Bowl. As you know, Ethics Bowl is a kind of competitive event that happens at multiple levels. At the high school level, hosted by us here at UNC Chapel Hill, at the intercollegiate level, increasingly at the middle school level. Ethics Bowl is also a really kind of useful tool for outreach, a really nice way to engage the community and to bring them in an accessible and inviting way. Increasingly, we've been using Ethics Bowl for folks across the lifespan, folks of all ages from all walks of life. And today we're particularly excited to focus on adults in the workplace and the various ways in which we might imagine sort of bringing the Ethics Bowl to life in various professional contexts.
So here's a closer look at what we're up to today. First, we'll start with a brief overview of the Ethics Bowl activity as it exists across the country. Second, we'll zoom in and take a look at an individual Ethics Bowl match, think of a little bit about how it works before we transition to talking about its pedagogical kind of backing. Third, we'll look at that backing. We'll talk a little bit about what kind of inroads with various communities we have and what the sort of pedagogical essentials of our program are. And finally, we'll try to demonstrate what a sample workplace integration might look like by providing you all with some sample resources to fit some different use cases across different kinds of workplaces. So we'll start with a quick overview. The National High School Ethics Bowl is a signature program of the Parr Center at UNC Chapel Hill. The basic idea is that it's a nationwide outreach program geared toward moral and civic education for high school students in particular. It's designed to get students of prime developmental age, the sort of future inheritors of our democracy, thinking, talking, and ultimately, we hope, working together on some of the toughest and moral and political issues that define our time. The core value of it is to do those things which are hard, to preserve space for constructive conversation about controversial issues, but that isn't disrupted, but actually improved by disagreement. So the Parr Center is NHSEB's home and headquarters. The program was founded in 2012, and so is just now reaching a pretty exciting, we think, adolescence. My team takes responsibility over the kind of strategic and pedagogical direction of the program, and we oversee a pretty large scale operation these days. So we have a network of 40 regional high school ethics bowls in 31 states. At last accounting, we serve right around 4,000 students from over 300 schools of various kinds across the country. All of those students first compete in their closest regional events and ultimately vie for a chance to qualify for the NHSEB Nationals, usually held each spring in Chapel Hill. So at the Parr Center, we really believe in Ethics Bowl's potential not only to drive kind of good and productive conversations, but the virtues of democratic citizenship as well. So in addition to growing kind of upstart Ethics Bowl programs in other countries, you'll see some examples here. We're working to extend involvement with the Ethics Bowl kind of across the lifespan, as Michael mentioned earlier, by not only working closely with our partner in the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl, but beginning to promote work with middle school students and with older adults as well. So the format of an Ethics Bowl match is essentially dialogical. It's based around the idea of a conversation, a give and take exchange between equals. Students on an Ethics Bowl team take up issues presented by a set of cases that we produce every year. They outline and deliver a position on the case for an opposing team and a panel of 3 judges. We're very different from debate in that we don't assign propositions or reasoning. Of course, the view the students defend is ultimately the view that they actually themselves hold. The opposing team then has a chance to comment on the first team's presentation. Then the first team has a right of reply in keeping with this sort of conversational format. Each exchange ends with a short Q&A session with a panel of judges who are often academics, professionals, and other community members. Teams are paired for head-to-head matchups so that each team has a chance to go through this process once. So each sort of half of the match looks like this. So the goal of this whole exchange, right, the reason that we do it all, isn't to subdue the opposing argument with superior rhetoric, right? The idea is for the students to work together to move toward something which is true or reasonable, and to do so together. Unlike in speech and debate, but very much like in life, changing your mind in response to new arguments isn't necessarily a bad thing. So at the end of the match, students are scored not only on the quality and clarity of their reasoning, but of course on the way that they engage with each other. Are they respectful? Are they productive? Ultimately, are their conversations the kind of deliberative ones that we think befit a democratic society? So the Ethics Bowl aims to isolate the skills that makes these kind of conversations not only possible, but regular among its participants. And many of our participants agree that the NHSEB has made a pretty sizable impact, not only on their critical thinking and argumentative skills, right? Those things which are sort of academically helpful, but those skills which are kind of socially and politically formative as well, reasoning together and engaging productively across disagreement. Students regularly tell us that these experiences are kind of empowering and transformative in some ways. And here are just a couple of words from them.
You become a better person. Learning about sort of who you are is fun. Sort of what you value helps determine what you want to do in your life. You also become a better citizen because a lot of ethics sort of play into learning what you value in terms of like policy and law. And you also just become a better student. Personally, my academics improved greatly after Ethics Bowl, just because it's critical thinking, a lot of writing and speaking and just creating arguments.
A lot of that argument is the result of fear and the fear of not understanding one another. But once that fear is removed and understood and unpacked, then discussion is very possible and it's very important.
So we're going to abstract away a little bit from the case of high school ethics bowl and think about the kind of pedagogical core behind the activity, something that's portable, transferable, something that we can use in different forms with different audiences for the same ends, for kind of promoting deliberative and democratic practices, promoting civic virtues, promoting collaboration and the finding of common ground, and so on. The first thing to say about this is that we're taking a case-based reasoning approach, of course, with a distinctive twist, or at least one that we think is worth emphasizing, namely by focusing on kind of the ethical toolkit. So when it comes to case-based reasoning, not much needs to be said in favor of it. The kind of virtues of case-based reasoning are clear. You can tailor the cases in a kind of highly specific way to the relevant domain. So the audience you're working with, you can choose a case that sort of fits their professional context if they're working adults. And more broadly, you can find ways to kind of present people with engaging, concrete, normative case studies that are accessible with no matter who you're working with. While we think that kind of beginning from the ground up is a really promising approach, and that's what lends itself well, or why the case-based reasoning approach kind of lends itself well to, I think it would be a mistake to go so far in the direction of being particularistic about case studies that you neglect to give your audience or the folks involved a kind of conceptual vocabulary. One, rooted, at least in our case and from our backgrounds, in philosophical theory and the work of ethical, political, moral philosophers. There's a really pragmatic reason for offering this kind of shared vocabulary. Folks need a kind of shared language in order to have disagreements in the first place, intelligible ones at least, in order to sort of collaboratively problem solve, find common ground, reduce disagreement, make principled distinctions between views, discard some in favor of others. That shared language and kind of conceptual repertoire is really essential. I also think folks might benefit in some form or another from the kind of conceptual clarity that comes with learning some philosophical notion that's been worked out well by a philosopher and by philosophers over many years. So I've got some examples here. The possibilities are numerous when it comes to the ethical toolkit for reasons that should be clear. The toolkit, by design, this kind of conceptual repertoire, is pluralistic. It doesn't favor or kind of valorize one particular normative theory. It doesn't sort of try to take sides on which first order normative ethical theory is the best, nor is it a theory-driven approach. So you'll notice by some of the examples on the screen, responsibility, nudging, the veil of ignorance, risk and harm, collective action. These notions are wide-ranging. They're quite distinct. They're sort of different in degree and in kind. So it's really important, we think, that the toolkit is itself pluralistic. Any given notion may or may not be shared across different moral theories. So for example, one of the items in the toolkit is equality or impartiality. Of course, those are words on the lips of both consequentialists and deontologists. There's nothing about those notions sort of pre-theoretically that favors one or the other. And that's a way of capturing that kind of important pluralism. The toolkit also has the virtue of avoiding a kind of the vice of name dropping and avoiding the possibility of kind of jargon-ridden invocation of philosophical theories that maybe some folks haven't encountered, which in many ways can stymie conversation rather than promote it. So you avoid that kind of jargon problem, that inaccessibility problem. Another feature of the toolkit, I think, is that it's broadly speaking particularistic, in that it encourages the kind of deliberators, the folks thinking about the case with the use of the toolkit, to focus on the kind of richness and texture of the concrete problem at hand, rather than encouraging them to kind of algorithmically apply universal theories to particular facts or something like that. There's something about the toolkit, again, that by design makes you appreciate the particulars and the kind of richness of the case, rather than sort of trying to reduce it to this kind of universal theory. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that this is a good result. Sort of speaking as a historian of philosophy, the toolkit is in many ways truer to the spirit, the purpose, the design of ethical theorizing throughout its history. And maybe with the sole exception of consequentialism, most moral philosophers didn't take themselves to be providing flat-footed decision procedures that could be mindlessly applied in a plug-and-chug fashion. So I think that one other virtue I want to mention is that if you take the kind of toolkit approach, you avoid this kind of clunkiness that has resulted from the following. So many people say that deontology and utilitarianism and virtue ethics are the big three ethical theories. Already, virtue ethics is sort of a strange sibling there, doesn't fit well in the taxonomy. And then some attempt to bring in, for good reasons, notions of care. But there's something about that taxonomy that doesn't quite work well, and that's just because the premise of those, fitting those theories together is mistaken. With the toolkit, you avoid this kind of clunkiness problem. So there's the examples you see on the screen. I just want to mention some dimensions along which the toolkit items differ. Some are methodological, so the veil of ignorance, reflective equilibrium being another, tell you something about the way in which you might adjudicate ethical or normative conflicts or cases or intuitions. Some are more conceptual and abstract than others, so like impartiality, paternalism, egalitarianism. Some notions in the toolkit have heavily domain specific, so fiduciary duty, burden of proof, advanced directives, nudging. These are all sort of notions that, of course, are ethically normatively valenced, but they show up in particular domains, maybe solely or predominantly. So as I say, I think there's a really big payoff here that the ethics bowl prizes when you take the toolkit approach. The conversation remains to the greatest extent possible. And in many ways, this is a sort of condition on good, free, and equal deliberation, accessible to all and generally jargon free. There's room for teaching and takeaways. There's room for learning new concepts from what the philosophers have produced, but not in a way that's so heavy-handed that it sort of shuts down conversation or leaves people out. Okay, so that brings me to the kind of norms of deliberation, the kind of discursive norms that might sort of guide the discussion. So Alex touched on, when talking about the match breakdown, for example, some of the kind of basic framing devices we might use when thinking about the ethics bowl. And it's like a conversation is the word he used. And I think it's really important when you bring the ethics bowl, frankly, and in any context, this is important, but when you're bringing it into a professional context, that it's communicated from the outset that the kind of governing norm is a conversational one, a collaborative one, rather than an adversarial one. And so there's, I think, a kind of nice representative passage by Tony Layden where I think he encapsulates this kind of this distinctive kind of reasoning that there's something informal about it, or at least more polite and more sort of the interlocutors are more vulnerable to one another, but it's also serious and potentially about serious things. So the quotation on the screen, I won't read it for you, but I think Tony Layden's kind of social conception of reasoning is one example. There are other kind of theoretical frames you might use, like notions of deliberative democracy and the norms that govern it that would be helpful. But it's important to establish from the outset that this is the kind of conversation we're having. And I'll give you one example to sort of make this really concrete. This is coming from a graduate school of education course with educational leaders and educators, for which there was an ethics bowl as a kind of capstone classroom project at the end of the course. And we'll talk about that when we get to sort of professional use cases. But from the very beginning, we established a few sort of norms of discussion, norms of discourse, especially around controversial, vexed issues about the foundations and aims and policies around education. The ones that I would sort of like to point out and bring to your attention are one, this isn't a zero-sum game. Conversational norms are different from the norms of debate. And then finally, the last one, which I think brings out another element of this from a slightly different angle, which is to respect the fact of reasonable disagreement. And I say something, I gloss that difficult notion in one way, which is that disagreement is reasonable when competent engagement with the relevant consideration is compatible with reaching different conclusions. And of course, this is one of the potential kind of upshots of participating in an ethics bowl. Folks might change their mind, folks might find common ground, folks might agree. And I think there's actually interesting cases where even when folks agree, they deepen that agreement in new ways, but folks might also not agree, especially, given the subject matter that tends to be in the purview of these kind of deliberative discussions. And that's okay. And actually, that's a good thing. And I think the potential for Ethics Bowl is to kind of bring these discursive norms and allow them, into the workplace and allow them to sort of permeate the workplace in just the same way that you might say, well, democracy is not the only, it doesn't just happen on election day. It's not just what happens at the voting booth. Democracy is everywhere. So too, these kinds of deliberative practices can permeate, whether everyday talk or boardroom talk or policy, discussions in assemblies. It runs the full range. And I think this really kind of makes that clear. The really important thing I think about here is that when it comes to integrating Ethics Bowl into different professional environments, there's a chance to make those environments more deliberative and that discourse that much more vibrant, that much healthier and more collaborative. So I think in many ways, you can think of the professional, any given professional context as a kind of microcosm or potential microcosm for a deliberative space that can sort of attain to different levels and different degrees those ideals that Alex mentioned, like kind of free and equal mutual justification and providing of mutually acceptable reasons. And I think importantly, the last thing I want to say on the topic of norms is instilling from the very beginning, and this is built, I think, into the conversational analogy, a sense of provisionality at any given time about your own view, about the kind of collective shared view, and about the way that that view might evolve in light of new information. That kind of experimental spirit, sense of provisionality is really important in order for there to be a genuine exchange in which all parties are open to learning something new and to finding common ground. So with that, we're going to transition now to kind of thinking about concrete use cases, some of which will be kind of rooted in experience, some of which will be aspirational nature. This is sort of new thinking. We're really excited to be sort of working on this with you and thinking out loud about it. And we look forward to getting your feedback. I think Alex will get us started with thinking about a kind of professional use case and what it might look like.
Right. So rather than the competitive program at scale that we use with high school students, we're proposing a bit of a different tack to build out these kind of discursive environments in other contexts. So we've done a little bit of this in the classroom at various levels, but we're really interested in doing so in workplace contexts as well. So imagine the following use case. Your company wants to engage its employees in hopefully a productive conversation about some feature of workplace culture, a rule, a policy, or maybe even so far as to kind of build a more cooperative or inclusive environment more generally. The idea we propose is a synthesis of the kinds of norms and resources that we kind of laid out for you. So I've perhaps oversimplified the process into 3 steps. First, you give participants a kind of stimulus. We're just calling it a text here, but it can be anything, a rule, a more general policy, or even just language about company culture. In this case, suppose we just use something from an employee manual, suppose about expected behaviors and decorum around the office. That's a bit of a pre-pandemic analogy, but you get the idea. Pair that with a particular case designed to get folks thinking about the issues, the values, and the stakes. In this case, we've picked one from our own searchable archives, but IEB has their cases archived as well, and you can get these from a variety of places. Company Woman, the case we've picked, is about a young man who wants to quit his job at a tech company and go back to school. He gets into a good graduate program and is planning to head there in a few months. But in the meantime, while he's still at work, he plans to ask his boss for a raise. If he's going to be around for a few months longer, he might as well kind of pad his bank account a little, he reasons. After all, grad stipends aren't a lot, you know. He tells a friend at work, and the friend is asked by their manager whether she has any kind of pertinent information to share, given that their relationship is a good one. They have a good working relationship, they're friends outside work. She, of course, speaks highly of her friend, but kind of spills the beans on our hero's plan to go to grad school. He doesn't get the raise, the friendship suffers, and we hope a fruitful conversation ensues. So you can imagine how this might go from here. The third step, right, pair a discussion of the case not only with that initial stimulus, but with a normative concept, a broad one, like the distinction between lying and deception. Or maybe even the slightly more complex relationship between lying and omission. Notably, as Michael mentioned, to sort of bring in the toolkit concept here, you don't have to have read your Kant to do this well. What builds out from there, the plan goes, is a conversation informed by the norms that we walked through earlier. This can either be formatted as a kind of workplace bowl, we'll show you some resources about that toward the end, or a kind of more free-flowing conversation in keeping with our discursive norms. The hope is that rather than having a sort of weird, awkward, or maybe one-way or stilted conversation about rule compliance, it gets employees thinking and talking in a kind of productive, proactive, and engaged way about the culture of their own workplace. So we've tried this model in a few other contexts, most notably, I think, with educators and policymakers?
So when it comes to the education sector, we can think about the kind of professional use case in a few different ways. I'll talk now in particular about ways in which Ethics Bowl can be brought to teachers, educators, and also educational leadership more broadly, so to schools, teachers being the kind of paramedic example here. One thing I just want to flag is the interesting work that's being done as we speak, this kind of open question in research being done by a friend and colleague of ours named Nick Tanchuk at Iowa State University and other folks in ed schools and kind of cognate departments who've been looking at the kind of dearth of ethics education, professional ethics education for pre-service teachers. And to put it in a nutshell, there are many reasons to think that giving pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, educators, educational leaders at all levels, opportunities to think intentionally about the ethical dimensions of their practice, which it should go without saying, is a kind of ethically, politically fraught practice in so many different ways, will benefit both the student and the educator and the school. It has a lot of potential to benefit these professionals, both in their training and in their practice. So that brings me to my own kind of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal contribution to this kind of open and interesting question about the potential for Ethics Bowl in this professional context. In the class that I mentioned at the Graduate School of Education at Penn that culminated in a bowl, we had studied, but prior to that, actually running the Ethics Bowl as a class, the kind of ethical, philosophical, and political and social foundations of education, the aims of education, what education should look like in a kind of pluralistic, multicultural, democratic society, how principles of justice should govern the way in which education is distributed, so on and so forth. When it came to the kind of end of the course, we had a kind of unprecedented opportunity to run an Ethics Bowl for educators, where they had the opportunity to kind of bring that theoretical reflection down to earth and sort of model the deliberative norms and practices we had been talking about, that we had been enshrining all along, translate some of that philosophical, ethical theory into kind of effective, thoughtful leadership and action. So the cases we used for the in-class bowl that kind of encapsulated these, the theoretical kind of threads of the class were drawn from Myra Levinson's wonderful collection at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, found in her book, Democratic Discord. The thing I'd like to mention now about this kind of anecdotal evidence and this kind of unprecedented offering of an ethics bowl for educational leaders is that the reviews and the kind of self-reflection that happened afterwards were really enlightening, really promising, and got us very excited about expanding this opportunity, especially for educators in North Carolina and across the country potentially, but we have a lot of exciting inroads in the near future and opportunities there. One student in the class, a superintendent of a major city school system, said that this exercise made him think about doing something like this for his 87 principals and 3,000 teachers in the district as a professional learning opportunity, and just said, flat out and put it right before us that this is something that he thinks would help and benefit the practice of education in his district. Someone else said that for the first time, they were thinking about the value of creating procedures for all students and teachers to practice deliberating in the way that we hope our political leaders would. And finally, I'll just mention one other testimonial. Another educator said that they found the Ethics Bowl to be a transformative experience. They found themselves listening more intently and therefore learning from their teammates as opposed to from the opposing team. And they plan to utilize this model in their practice, in their professional practice, and hope that it guides and serves as an ideal for educational decision making. So we think this is a really exciting space in which to kind of introduce the Ethics Bowl in many ways, the school is the microcosm of the society, and there's opportunities, of course, in the classroom, and we have a kind of interest and foothold in that direction. But there is a very real kind of need and opportunity for the practice of education as a profession to sort of be exposed to some of the deliberative practices that Ethics Bowl promises. So on the slide, you'll find an example of one way in which, among many, you might combine a kind of text prompt, which for the purposes of the example is a school policy, supposing it's a school policy instituting restorative practices, or at least incentivizing restorative practices over more traditional punitive measures. The toolkit notion being a kind of quick introduction to various normative theories of punishment, kind of retributive rationales, broadly consequentialist rationales, restorative rationales for punishment, and so on. And the case drawn from the National High School Ethics Bowl case set is Wholesome Discipline, which centers on this very question about not only the kind of empirical facts about the way in which punishment is distributed in schools, but the kind of normative dimensions of it. So the last use case that I want to talk to you about concerns policymakers, broadly construed city employees, municipal government employees, folks working at various levels of city government. So there's a little bit of precedent. So for example, some of my predecessors in my position and some of the folks in the philosophy department at UNC have run ethical leadership workshops for employees at the city of Durham. And there was kind of a broadly deliberative and case-based approach taken there. And so too with human resources at the university. There is sort of proof of concept, and I think a great deal of possibility for Ethics Bowl to be used and as a kind of opportunity for folks in government to maybe slow down a bit and sort of think through some of the complexity of the issues. It's a kind of rare opportunity, I think, in what's an otherwise fast-paced kind of line of work, especially on the policymaking side, driven in some ways by necessity, oftentimes more than other things. And so the aspiration here is just deliberative style programming in general that's going to lead to more reflection on the ethical normative dimensions of policymaking, and also with kind of opportunities to bring in the relevant empirical expertise and cutting edge empirical work that's of interest. We'll see this sort of play out in the concrete use that I might propose. So there's something analogous. I think another possibility is to do something analogous to what we do sometimes when we integrate Ethics Bowl in other contexts like the classroom. If an Ethics Bowl full stop or in its full form is not possible, you might be able to isolate features of it and kind of make a deliberative activity around that. I think there's ways in which you can play with the form if necessary. If, for example, there are, as I imagine there might be, constraints on time, worries about sort of overly regimenting the discussion or perhaps gamifying it in the sense that there's a kind of competition that they're participating or something like that. I think if you have a self-selecting group of voluntary, participants, for the most part, those worries will be assuaged. But I think if they're not, there's ways to mitigate it. So here's a kind of one proposal, again, in an endless sea of possibilities with trying it out with policymakers. You might take as a text prompt Stanford University has a white paper on universal basic income, an increasingly hot topic and focus of discussion among cities. There's of course the kind of Mayors for Guaranteed Income Consortium. So you could imagine Durham, which is in fact a member, having a kind of live discussion about experimenting with UBI, universal basic income, and perhaps importantly, one implication of that being replacing existing welfare assistance programs and supplanting it with UBI, with maybe just cash transfer of some kind. Maybe it's not a universal basic income. Maybe it's just lump sum giving of money rather than in-kind welfare assistance programs, where there's restrictions and conditions of various kinds. Of course, there's there are really important sort of empirical questions involved here, many of which the folks participating in the bowl are going to be best positioned. Some of the empirical literature, maybe they'll have an opportunity to be introduced to for the first time, but some of the kind of nitty gritty about existing policy and the way the introduction of a new policy impacts standing policy, they're the ones best positioned to sort of be aware of those complexities, of which you should be very, very sensitive. But there's also an opportunity to kind of give them the chance to think about the ethical dimension. So the toolkit we recommended here, the toolkit notion is paternalism. It's fairly uncontroversial to say that in some way or another, governments often act paternalistically in the way they implement welfare programs. So if there's any kind of employment conditions, or are there any kind of restrictions on not, you have to test and be test-free, drug-free before receiving some kind of benefit, not being able to use SNAP benefits on sugary drinks, so on and so forth. There's a kind of open question, normative question about what degree of paternalism is kind of acceptable. And it would be up for debate, for example, up for discussion rather, whether the concrete proposal in the city of Durham, and in light of some of this kind of outside evidence that's coming in, new cutting edge evidence, whether it's kind of problematically paternalistic, unpaternalistic, and there can be a kind of live conversation in which it plays out. It's a really kind of a rare space and collaborative opportunity for that conversation to play out. And as I say, I think it's one that all too rarely happens in the kind of government line of work, where there just might not be those opportunities. So that's the last use case. I'm going to hand it over to Alex, who will kind of close this out. And we really appreciate your feedback and your interest, and look forward to hearing from you.
Right. Thanks, Michael. Just as a quick addendum to that, and to kind of wrap us up here, we'd like to invite you to check out some of the resources we're kind of actively developing to help bring Ethics Bowl into these new contexts. So if you follow this link or scan the QR code on your screen, you'll be taken to a folder full of all kinds of goodies. You'll see cases, a format for a workplace bowl, and more. We're happy to talk about these in our chat and to answer whatever questions you might have. You should also feel free, of course, to get in touch with us for more information, or you can keep up with our activities online at the links provided here. So thanks, everyone. I think we'll leave things there. Thank you for your time and engagement. Stay safe and take care.